Well, good morning, everyone. April 1st, April Fool's Day. We ought to be able to really get some good stuff done today. But anyways, this is the Senate Ag Committee's Thursday morning meeting. And want to welcome our guests. We have Mark Perot, Fay Mack, Jim Demarez, and Rosie Kruger with us, and Brianna. So we got a full crew. And we're, of course, back on to S100, the Universal Meals Program. And I think we've been together long enough so everybody knows everybody. And Mark, you're new to the crew, and did Senator Kitchell reach you this morning, Mark?
No.
Well,
Mark and I spoke, Bobby. So
Oh.
he's pretty clued in, I think.
Yeah. So I guess I don't know if there's new numbers but Mark, have you had the opportunity to go through our numbers that Brianna presented to us in regards to doing the meals program, I guess, in two different ways, with using the Dr. Dinosaur numbers, as well as if we went to the full universal meals program.
I think Brianna can actually address the cost estimates better than I can. I was under the assumption this morning that you were going with the latest draft that I looked at that would have provided school breakfasts only.
Well, we've got that on the table as well.
Okay.
That's a cheaper program that we could use as an alternative and a starting point. And at our caucus last night, there was concern in regards to the letters that we were all receiving in regards from the superintendents and principals about going to the full-blown universal meals program and running it through their budgets, how it was going to cost them, like North Country told me it was going to cost them, the district, $600 and some odd thousand, which I don't know if that's an accurate number or not, because we do pretty well with our state aid dollars, up here with our income levels and all of that. But I know in Troy, like our budget's like 3 million some odd $1,000. And if we went to a universal meals program, he said it would cost us like 30 some odd $1,000. And I don't know if that's accurate or not, but in Senator Kitchell from the Appropriations Committee thinks that she can't figure out, Rosie, why we can't run just a different set of numbers through the agency if we went to the 8th level of the Dr. Dinosaur cutoff, why that would be such a drastic change that it would take a year to get it set up. But I told her that I thought you probably knew what you were doing and you know, that we had to go by what you told us and so that's where we are with that one. I don't think we really talked a lot about going just with the breakfast program. It was mentioned, but not a lot of conversation. Chris, if you're there and you have a different take on any of this, let me know.
Yeah, well, one
Yeah,
question that I'd love Rosie or Faye to help, or maybe staff. This idea that Sarah Kitchell is, you know, she is persistent, of pegging to the Dr. Dinosaur. I have asserted that potentially leaves us with federal dollars on the you know, without drawing down federal dollars. And can you, and Brianna has told us that if we went whole hog on this and got to every school using universal, that the estimate is, I think the feds pick up about 10 million, contribute about 10 million. But am I right that we all understand that if you hit whatever it is, over 40% free and reduced, then the feds will pay for your, you know, will reimburse you for every meal. But talk to me about the implication for federal dollars if we were to try, even though Rosie thinks, and I tend to agree, that it would be hard to administer, but let's just pretend that we go the Dr. Dinosaur route. What does that mean? Does that mean, am I accurate in saying that we would then not have access to as much federal money?
I don't think it really impacts the federal money that you're drawing down. What you're talking about is, sorry, I'm having a little bit of audio. You're talking about adding a group of kids where you would pay the difference between the federal reimbursement rate, the federal free reimbursement rate, and the federal paid reimbursement rate. So for those meals, the feds would still pay 40 cents per lunch and 30 cents per breakfast, as they do with any meal at the federal paid level. So you wouldn't really be impacting the federal funds. You might assume that you would have lower participation among that group of students who are above that threshold. So you might not be serving more meals above that threshold and drawing down the 40 cents and 30 cents for those meals above. I don't think that has a huge impact overall. But, you know, I do want to reemphasize administratively, this is really difficult. If this was a Vermont only program, we could move the thresholds around no problem, but the federal threshold is 185% of federal poverty. And so we already track a free category, a reduced category, and a paid category that are the federal categories. We aren't just broadening the free category if we were to add this Vermont threshold, we're adding a fourth category in. And that's what makes it really administratively complicated. And we need to amend all these kind of off-the-shelf national systems that all the schools are using to count meals, as well as our own state agency system. And that's what would take the time and be expensive and add a lot of confusion. The other kind of funny thing to think about is that this would actually be pretty confusing for households as well, because there are a number of benefits that households qualify for if they qualify for free and reduced price meals based on that 185% of federal poverty. So for example, reduced or waived SAT testing fees. There's a bunch of current, you know, with all the COVID funds, there's some new telecommunications and internet benefits that are being provided to families that qualify for free and reduced meals. All of that assumes we're using the federal threshold. And so if you start tossing in this new Vermont threshold, you're going to have a lot of confusion from families about whether they're actually eligible for these kind of nationwide type benefits that use that federal threshold. You know, maybe that's not a reason not to do it, but it's just another one of these complicating factors by trying to create our own thing that's outside of the federal program. And, you know, there's just a lot of different pieces to it. And that's why I do not think, particularly given COVID, that this is something that would be implementable for next fall.
So,
Thank you.
Ro-
That helps. Did Faye? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Chair.
so Rosie, schools, children that eat lunch at school that pay the full price for their meals above the 185%, the schools don't report those meals to the department and get anything back from the feds?
They do report those meals. They report them in the paid category, and they get
Okay.
40 cents per meal for lunch and 30 cents per meal for breakfast.
Okay, and they report that to you or your department. So instead of them sending you, like in our little school, maybe Troy, for 25 meals a day above the threshold, they sent you a note for the meals that were paid, and there's 100 kids instead of 25. What, I mean, and we would pay the difference, or we would give you the money for those children above 185% up to 380%. There'd be another couple hundred percent in there that we would send you the money, and then you would take that number that the schools send you and pay it. That would mess up your system if they were all still coming in under paid meals.
Yeah, because we would need some way for them to tell us which were the paid students under the Vermont free category and which were the paid students who don't qualify for the Vermont free category. So they would need to be keeping track of those students separately, and they'd have to modify their systems to do that. And these are off-the-shelf systems that they buy from national vendors. It's like a point of sale system where at the end of the line, where the kids are going through the line, they're entering the student's ID number or the student's name, and the system is tracking the student's status and tallying all those up. And then at the end of the month, they take a report out of that system and submit it up to us through our electronic system. So all of that needs to be modified to add this fourth category of Vermont paid, so that we know who to charge, the feds or the state, for those meals. And that is just a long process to get all that fixed and modified. And those companies aren't going to do it for free. So there's that consideration as well.
Yeah. Chris, you were going to ask a question. I cut you off.
Well, Faye, I wondered, Faye put her hand up and was going to maybe have weigh in on my initial question.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Rosie just said, and wanted to just add a couple of points to that question that you raised, Senator Pearson. So the first is that with the idea of using Dr. Dinosaur to create a fourth category, schools would no longer enroll in a universal school meal program through the federal provisions into the community eligibility provision or provision 2. And one of the ways that the reimbursement will shift over time is that in the provision 2, which is what most schools would use, the way that, and I'm going to try to explain this without getting really, really deep in the weeds, because it's not super cut and dry, but I think it's important to understand when you're talking about the federal reimbursement part. So when a school moves into provision 2, their first year is a base year, and the meals are offered for free. And based on who actually participates in the meal program, for how the percentage of the students who are qualify as paid, reduced, or free, that ratio carries forward with them for multiple years. And that's the ratio that determines, no matter how many meals are served, there's the ratio of which federal reimbursement category each meal gets. And what we see over time is that in the first year, because it's the first year that meals are offered universally, and school meal applications are still collected in order to identify who categorizes as a paid or reduced or free student. We see a greater percentage of the students who qualify for free meals participating in the program than paid meals. But what happens over time as the culture changes in the cafeteria and the meals, universal school meals becomes more normalized and the stigma goes away, you start to see more and more kids participate, right? So the participation increases and we see a larger percentage of the students who would have qualified for paid meals start to eat, but the ratio stays the same. So that works out financially and that's financially beneficial for the school. They're going to draw down more meals paid at the free rate from the federal government. So it's hard to quantify what that loss is in federal reimbursement, but it means that under universal meals that would be paid out by the federal government at the high rate will only be getting that 30 cents for lunch instead of the few dollars. So there is some shift in loss of federal dollars. It's really hard to quantify, but I think it's worth noting. And then the other two things I just wanted to mention, which I know we've talked about before, and I just want to also bring into the conversation, is that with creating a fourth category and still having students paying for meals and not having students have to fill out a school meal application, you'll still have students who need school meals and can't afford them who won't be eating, even if it's free, offered for free for them, because the stigma doesn't go away. You'll have students in that 185% of poverty and below who still won't participate, and students in this new fourth category who are newly eligible for free meals who won't participate because they have friends who have to pay, and there's still that cash register aspect and that stigma over the meals in the cafeteria of who's eating the reimbursable meal and who's getting the a la carte foods and all of that. And so that's not going to go away, which is one of the big goals of universal school meals. And then the last thing I just wanted to bring back into the conversation too is that if this fourth category were created and those meals were reimbursed by the state in some way from the general fund or some way where it's not the schools reimbursing, that's going to shift the dynamic for the schools that already provide universal school meals. And they may very likely consider stopping their universal school meals program to go into this new option of having the fourth category, because it means they'll have meals that they're currently paying for with their school budget that could be covered by the state. And so we would lose schools likely who are providing universal school meals.
So do we have, I mean, we've got to have, some good hard facts to get the chair of appropriation off the dime on not, paring the overall cost down. And we got that at caucus last night a little bit about the overall total cost if we went to a full universal meals. And if we go just with the breakfast, we didn't talk a lot about that last night. Didn't get a lot of feedback, if I remember right. Chris, do you recall any? We didn't get much feedback on that. And I don't know I don't think we have the numbers either between what we're doing at the 185%. I think we know how many children are eating for free up to that point. But if we went with the limits of the Dr. Dinosaur program, we don't know how many more children we would pick up. We know how many children there are in the Dr. Dinosaur program, but that are under 19 years old, but we don't know for sure how many more students we would pick up by going that route. And I don't know if Brianna or Mark have fooled with those numbers at all.
Yes, we did come up with an estimate for that based on the number of students that are in the Dr. Dinosaur program. And then we came up with a way to analyze that for different poverty groupings in terms of how many students are actually already covered by the free and reduced meals, which is about 33,000 students, and then to extend it further out to all of the students that qualify for the Dr. Dinosaur or at 317% of the federal poverty line, we calculate that will be an additional 16,400 students.
How many?
16,400 students.
And so if we take the 16, add it to the ones that are already getting free meals, did you add that number up?
Yes, that number is about 53,000 students. And to put that in perspective, the current public school count is about 82,200 students.
So there'd be roughly 29 to 30,000 that would still be left out.
That's correct. Those students would be a lot of the students that are not qualifying for any of the federal poverty line. So those would be a lot of the higher income students, just to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, Chris?
Well, go to Brian. He beat me to the punch.
Thank you, Senator Pearson. I'm trying to get my hands around this issue. Which way would more likely impact property taxes? In other words, if we go the Dr. Dinosaur route, what is the likely impact on local property taxes? If we go to the breakfast only universal plan, what is the likely impact on local property taxes? To me, that's a fair question.
It's a great question. So based on my cost estimates, the option to go with the Dr. Dinosaur students would range from about $10 million to $14 million, depending on the amount of students that participate in these programs. And we know that currently property taxes, about $8 million will raise tax rates statewide on average by about 1 penny. So if we do some simple math, it will look to be about $0.015 on the tax rate for the Medicaid Dr. Dinosaur option. If we look to the breakfast option, the cost range that I estimated was $6 to $10 million, again, depending on participation rates. And so doing the simple math again, the average tax rates would increase by about $0.01. So that's where we're
Kind
at.
of similar.
So, but the doctor, your question was in regards to Dr. Dinosaur, right, Brian?
Yes.
But we can't administer the damn thing. That's the problem there with Dr. Dinosaur, which would pick up more students, I believe. You know, another 16,000 children. Chris?
Rosie, can you remind us, no matter what we use for qualification, if I recall, there's a moment in the year when we say, boom, you are free and reduced, you are reduced, you're paying. Is that right? Or is there you can change? Don't we get set up on a, I mean, Faye was talking to us about your base year if you're moving into universal, but if we're not in a universal, can it be fluid, or how does that work?
So once a student qualifies, they qualify for the rest of the year, regardless of whether their family's income changes later in the year. but a family can submit an application at any point in the year. You might be thinking about, well, there's two pieces that you might be thinking about. One is there's a reporting deadline when the schools report their percentage of free and reduced students, and that's the percent that we use when we decide if the school is a high poverty school or not. And there's one reporting deadline that's October 1st that's used for all the non-child nutrition programs. There's another reporting deadline that's October 31st, which is for the child nutrition programs. And then we have an April 1st reporting deadline, which is the number of children who are directly certified, and that's what we use for the following year's community eligibility provision. So there are these points where we look to see, what is the number of students, but an individual household can apply at any point during the year, and once they qualify for the rest of the year.
Thank you.
So, Brianna, we've got the cost for Dr. Dinosaur if we went that route. We have the cost for the free breakfast program. What is the cost for the full universal meals program?
For the full universal meals program, we have an estimated additional cost range of $24 to $40 million.
So that would be 24 would be about 3 cents.
Yep. And on the high end, 40, it'd probably be closer to about 5 cents.
Well, of course, the superintendents love using the 5 cents. They're going to feed every kid for sure.
Mr. Chair, I see some sort of decision points in front of us, and I don't know if, when you're ready, it seems like we should hit some of those and narrow our options. And we haven't this morning talked about the funding mechanics of Jim's draft that takes it off the top and whether or not that's plausible. We did hear some interest in that. I guess I'll just be frank and say I'm not seeing this Dr. Dinosaur plan as a workable solution. So
Doesn't work.
Right.
We can't use it as a solution because it is not, we can't work it. So
to me, that leaves, are we happy with the whole thing coming off the top of the ed fund? Do we want to talk about doing that, but limiting it to, you talked about 20% of the schools phasing in, mandating, the first 20% that apply will get you enrolled next year and on and on. I've also been thinking that if I had to guess, I would bet that the feds will extend it another year, given their posture lately of trying to fix the economy a little bit. So we may, be wringing our hands in a way that's going to have no impact on the coming year. But I'd love to say, we could condition the bill to say, the moment the feds don't do this, here's what we're going to do. Or we could do this breakfast thing. I think we've hammered out the challenges. It seems to me we should focus on what we want to present and hope that others will agree with us.
Well, Brian?
Thank you, Bobby. And Chris, I understand what you're saying, but again, I want to make the point. The federal money is one-time money, in my view. So we need to look at this beyond that and just say, we're going to start a program that's going to be a continuing obligation. And if we do that, we can't just say, well, yeah, but the federal government's going to pay the first year.
I wasn't, that's not what I was saying. The federal government has extended universal meals already until September. There is a lot of discussion about them doing that for an additional year. I'm not talking about the ARPA money or any of that. I'm just saying, obviously, if the feds, during the pandemic, it hasn't cost the ed fund maybe it's
Right.
cost a little bit, but the feds have picked it up with this waiver through USDA. That's what I'm talking about. I think there's a pretty good chance, odds makers will tell you what it is, that they will do that again, and that's the federal money that I'm referencing.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, actually, I don't know if Rosie would know, schools should have saved a ton of money because the feds have been paying the whole bill. So
Well,
they aren't taking any of that into consideration. And I bet you when we get our new reports, their cost per student is going to be just the same, whether we've been feeding them out of our school budgets or it's coming out of Washington. Have you seen any schools send you reports, Rosie, that their costs have gone down?
I don't have any formal reports. I can tell you that it varies widely across the state. So first of all, the School Food Authority account is its own account, so they can't like pull money out of it to go, use for other things. Once the money comes in, it's got to stay in there and be used for child nutrition purposes. Although if there's a deficit, they have to make it whole with their general fund. So I know that some folks certainly are seeing a surplus in that account right now. A few more folks are actually in that position than normally would be, but we are also seeing some folks who are losing money because so many of their students are not in school. So if the kids are there and in person and they're feeding everybody, then generally their participation is much higher and they're drawing down more federal funding. But if half the kids are home, if they're doing a lot of remote or hybrid, then their participation is overall down and they're not making as much money and they're still having to pay the same staff. And then actually the packaging costs are really hurting some of them, because in order to provide the meals in the classroom or the meals at home, they're having to do a lot more packaging than they normally would if they were just feeding them in the lunch line. So it's really variable. Some of them are doing a lot better. Some of them are actually doing a lot worse.
Yeah.
We do have a surplus in the ed fund, I believe. So we should also take that into consideration.
And when Mark or you or Brianna, do you have any projections on how the school fund is gonna do out a year or two or three with projections? I know we had projections this spring that were pretty not very rosy, but then as we got going, the sales tax is doing good and revenues are coming in pretty good. Are there any projections on the school funding going up or down out into the future?
We don't have any projections beyond FY22 at this point, but as Senator Pearson pointed out, we are currently carrying a projected education fund surplus of about $17 million into FY22. So there is some money there, but keep in mind again, that's essentially one-time money. So if it's spent, it's gone.
So you haven't looked at sales tax increase, the revenues that are going into the ed fund to keep that solvent. Some of them are going to drop off after this year or next year.
No, I mean, we have to live with the official state forecast that came out in January, or the updates to it. So those are essentially fixed in the education fund outlook when we're doing analysis. And so any additional costs or reductions in costs would show up in the property tax. But you're right, going forward, if those revenue projections improve for the non-property tax monies, which account for about a third of the money in the ed fund, then things will improve going forward. But we haven't done any actual projections beyond FY22 yet.
So why I asked that is because if we went with the full meals program, we would cap that out at the first 20% of the schools that applied. would be in, and then the next 20% wouldn't come for a year later. So it would take a 5-year period to work into the full program, and at a cost of roughly $5 million a year. And if the projections were, well, we know that 22 we got 17 million. Well, if we add 23, and unless all heck breaks loose, and it would cost then 10 million, and it would keep working its way up, but at a very slow pace. And if we went with a full universal meals program, in the first year, totally it's going to cost us 3 cents. But if you divided that out by 5 years, it would knock it down to 6 or 7 tenths of a cent each year for running out to the limit. And I believe I'm right on that, or am I wrong?
I can't really speak to that, but I haven't seen anything in the drafts that would limit participation to the 20% per year.
Well, we've been talking about how to contain the cost so that it wouldn't bankrupt the system, and we could work into it gradually. Over the 5 years has been constant, I believe, in all of our drafts, but we never put a cutoff in there on the 20%. And I believe we'd have to do it on almost like on a student basis, because you could take 20% of our schools and you could get the low end of the populated schools. So it would throw that all to all over the place. But if it took 5 years to work into this, and we did have it limited to a 20% cost factor increase, wouldn't it just be part of a penny?
Go ahead, Brianna.
I would say each year incrementally it would be part of a penny, but of course that is going to continue to build on each other. So, by year 2, it would be over a penny, by year 3, and so on. So it continues to build. So yes, you would incrementally increase it year over year, but the net would still be coming up with all of the money to pay for it, because you are building and increasing that program cost year over year.
Yes, I realize that, but if we're on a trajectory of having $15 million surplus in 22, we haven't changed any taxes at all. Actually, we're picking up the tab where the tax commissioner came out last fall or December and said we were going to have to raise taxes by 8 cents. As far as I know, that's down to a penny right now. And Chris, have you guys fooled with that in finance? Yeah.
No, no, we haven't actually looked at the ed fund yet because we haven't.
Waiting for more info.
Yeah, I mean, I do think if we construct if we're paying for it out of the ed fund, you got to believe it's desirable for the schools. And so the first 20%, I think we could get Rosie or somebody to figure out how to make that fair. And Brianna's, obviously, we all understand that by the end you'll be paying the full freight, but it would ease the costs. One question I have for Rosie and Mark and Brianna, is what about the schools that are already doing this? I mean, there's no way in my mind we go forward with this proposal without handling them. That won't add cost to the ed fund because it's still being paid there, but it will change their local budget, which then may have some implications for their own budget and therefore the ed fund. So have you riddled through that at all? And what do we do about that?
So I guess I'd like to start by saying I have real concerns about you putting a limit of 20% each year. That hasn't been in the bill. It's kind of been an assumption that if it was paid for at the school level, only some of them would come on each year. But I think both me and Brianna have kind of said to you that if it's paid for at the state level, it's likely that everybody's going to want to come on the first year because it's state funding. Why wouldn't you do that? And so I think that's what you're trying to get at with capping them at or capping the first 20% each year. But any school can participate in Provision 2. And so I can't tell anybody that they can't participate. So what I'm going to have to do is pick among all of the schools who gets this state money this year and who doesn't. And that's going to be pretty administratively complex as well, because I'll have all these schools operating Provision 2, but only some of them are going to get the state funding. So I'm going to have to figure out how to pull that out and pay that separately. And I just don't know how to do that fairly. You know, all the schools who are already participating are going to say, sure, we'd love to have the state pay for that. And then, you know, am I going to say, okay, applications are open at 8 a.m. on Monday and whoever gets their application in first is who gets this? Like, do I look at free and reduced percentages? You know, I don't know how to do that fairly without it just, folks are going to feel unhappy with how that's implemented with, you know, any way we do it. So if you want.
We all have to make decisions that are not easy and sometimes not even pleasant. But, you know, that's just part of the process. I mean, we can't afford to pay it all at once, and some of them are going to just have to wait. And I think they shouldn't burden you. I mean, they should do their homework and get lined up. But if they don't make it by a certain date, they're shut off. If they do make it by a certain date and you've already reached the cap, I mean, we only have how many superintendents? 55, 60?
Something
well,
like that.
Those guys ought to be able to get organized a little bit so they in their districts so that they would have to make those choices.
Well, that's what I'm concerned about, is that they all apply at the same time. And then I have, if everybody submits their application at the same exact time, how am I supposed to decide between them? If you want to ease into it, I think you're much better off doing breakfast first. And that would be a way of dividing the cost over multiple years.
Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So help me understand too, how would that work in terms of a school district deciding? Does the school board hold a special election or a special meeting and have input from the community? Or does the superintendent just unilaterally decide that they're going to do it? How does, you know what I'm trying to say? How do the local people have a voice in this? Because it could affect their property taxes. And if a bunch of folks didn't want it to happen, it would seem like if the superintendent made the decision to go ahead, there'd be a little bit of a backlash. So how would that roll out? Does anybody have an answer?
I can tell you right now. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
No, go ahead.
It really depends on their school budgeting process. If they feel like it's going to cost them a significant amount of money out of the school budget, then they need to include that in the school budget, and the board needs to go through that whole process. If they feel like they can come up with the funds through through other means, then it may just be a decision of an administrator, usually the school board is involved, and usually it's part of the budgeting process, which is why it's kind of difficult at this point in the year, after school budgets have passed, to decide that they're going to go ahead and do it for next year.
That, if I can jump in, that also relates to the issue of how this works and how you pay for it. Right now, it would show up in a school district's budget and flow through to their education spending per pupil and their tax rates. If you were taking the money off the top of the education fund, the school would set their budget. They would then subtract that amount of money that they're getting from the education fund, and their education spending line would then not reflect that cost. It would be in their budgets, but it would not be in their education spending.
That's assuming that we pay for it out of the general fund.
It's assuming you pay for it out of the education fund as well, because we have, like, for example, we have categorical aid programs in the education fund right now. So a school would set their budget. They again get, for example, they get special education aid, which comes off, we subtract it from the budget. The remaining amount, which is their education spending, is divided by their pupil count, and that's how their tax rate's determined.
Thank you.
Mark, have you folks at JFO ever taken schools that have universal meals and compared them to similar sized schools without universal meals and looked at their per pupil spending?
No.
I can't believe that there's a big difference, but maybe there is. You know, if a school board figures its budget out, there's a lot of creative ways that you can keep your budget down and still feed the kids if
Right,
you
and
so design.
And of course, they have the option to do that now.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
to add to that, I would say that the schools that are doing it now, as we've heard in testimony, they're doing it because it makes financial sense for them. A lot of them are able to qualify for the community eligibility provision. We see that most of the schools are in that, and they do receive additional federal funding. And that is because of the ratio of students that they have that are low income. And so it would kind of be like comparing apples to oranges if we were to look at schools that are currently doing it versus schools that may do it in the future.
Chris?
Mark, maybe you could help us figure out a little bit another option, which is ARPA money. There is something cruel about this conversation where we're talking about tax rates and the pinch on school administrators. We've drifted away from the hunger question. We are soon going to, if last year is any indication, send hundreds of millions of dollars out the door for all sorts of worthy causes. And we will not come anywhere close to being assured that every last dollar that goes to businesses is well spent or truly in need, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We sent about 2 to 1 of our CARES money went to businesses compared to families, crudely speaking. Is there an option, as we understand it? I know we don't really understand where ARPA, all the parameters, but is there anything that prevents us that we know of so far from just taking $50 million from the federal relief dollars, putting it into the ed fund, and adding that to the, what did you say, $17 million surplus?
Mhm.
And saying we're just covering this for the first 3 years, and we'll figure it out after that. Do we know that's not allowed?
I don't know the answer to that question. Brianna's been working on some of the other stuff, so yeah.
Yeah, I would say that I have kind of 2 answers to that question. The first one would be that the reason we can't use the federal dollars to directly fund the meals program is because of the other regulations that are written into provision 2 and the community eligibility provision,
Right.
which are those programs that say that it needs to be state or local dollars. It has to be a non-federal source. So it's really on that end that we can't use the federal dollars. I would say to the other option, like just directly funding the education fund, the ESSER money, which is kind of the money that is directed towards education, it is relatively flexible in its uses, but it does have to be tied to something COVID-19 emergency related. And ESSER 3, the largest pool of money, it's about 28 million coming to the state, does have some additional parameters that need to be used, including 5% for learning loss, 1% for after school, 1% of the money for summer programs, and then a little bit more for administrative costs. So while there is a lot of money coming in, it does need to be, in alignment with the rules and having a strategic plan around that. So that's kind of the universe in which we're working. So there is a lot of money, and I think that it's a worthwhile conversation to have and how we use it and how to use it strategically. So that's what I would say to answer that question.
But if I could,
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
Brian.
so Chris, even if we could do that, and I don't know what the number is, 30, 40 million, again, there's a period at the end of that sentence. At some point, there is not that money anymore. So to me, that would almost mean that we'd have to sunset the bill to end things at a certain point, or be willing and responsible enough to admit that it would affect property taxes at that point. Am I
Well, it will
missing
affect
something?
the ed fund.
Yeah.
It will affect the ed fund. Yeah. Look, I mean, we don't buy food for free. I don't understand. This has always been about how to, is it worth it? And to me, it's worth it. It's worth putting this burden on the ed fund. I think the ed fund can handle it right now, but I don't seem to have the majority opinion. So
Well,
Jay has a question.
we know that we're carrying a $15 million deal ahead, a surplus ahead this year. And we've been in the pandemic for a whole year, and we're carrying 15 million forward. So what the heck's going to cut loose and go to heck so bad that we aren't going to have it to carry forward another year, an equal amount. And what I maintain is the school boards or the superintendents want this cushion so they can decide and play with a whole suitcase full of money any way they want to raise their budgets, but yet they don't want to feed the kids. And I'm saying we set policy and they're supposed to follow it to some degree. And I would think that school boards, instead of having that extra person or two around the schoolhouse collecting the money, and then the assistant principal chasing families all summer collecting money, it would be better if they spent their time educating the children than chasing and collecting money. And somebody standing behind a cash register all during lunch period collecting money. And but I don't know, I guess we can't do future outlooks on the economy and how the sales taxes are going to be running, or we can't ask JFO to do that. It's probably too shaky, but we do know that we've got some new products coming online that's gonna be having a sales tax increase on that product, and that should generate a bunch of new dollars. I don't know if I ever told you guys, but when I was on the school board, the school board didn't want to go to the taxpayers and asked for a rate increase, so they ran a deficit every year. And it took me a year to figure out what the hell they were doing, what was going on. And people would start calling me after the first of the year and asking if I could see about getting them some money, pay up the oil bill or pay the light bill. So I kept asking questions. Well, they were carrying a huge deficit and only paid the teachers after the first of the year and until June rolled around, and then they'd get their new allotment. And I was the moderator at that point in time too, and I was like 22 years old. And I went to the town meeting. I said, look, this is what's going on at our schoolhouse, and I need $1 increase on the tax rate to catch this mess up that we're in, but I'll get it back for you within a couple of years. And those old guys on the school board said, oh, that'll end you up, Bobby. You're all done. We'll get rid of you after once and for all. Well, here I am 50 odd years later, and I'm still representing the same people. But people will take an increase if it's going to provide a benefit, I guess is what I'm getting at. And those people that pay the big taxes are the same ones that are having to pay for their own children's meals. And then we lose all those others in between the 180 percentile and them that just don't have the money and can't eat. So no, I'm not. I think if we can figure out a system to work this in, that so that we don't get any big bumps and stick with, 3/4 of a cent or whatever increase, if it had to be increased, that we wouldn't be placing a burden on our taxpayers. And some of them, like somebody was saying, even got a decrease. I think somebody just this morning testified that their overall spending actually went down because of the meals program. So anyways, where are we going?
Senator Starr, can I just jump in here for a minute because I'm going to have to leave?
Yes.
And I just wanted to add a couple of things. If you decide to go ahead with this, the draft that I've seen does not have an appropriation in it. The draft also uses the education payment line item in the education fund to provide the money. And I think it would need to be in a separate line item and added to one of the enumerated uses of the education fund dollars. So I will come back and try to catch up with where you are, but I think that the drafts I've seen have a couple issues with them that would need to be addressed if you move ahead with this.
Yeah, and I don't know about the rest of the committee, but we were talking about having the cost of this come right off the top of the ed fund. Where we got 1.7 billion or something like that in the ed fund?
Yes, and if it does come out of the education fund, I think you still need to have an appropriation. And I think it has to be added to one of the enumerated permissible uses of education fund dollars so that you don't trigger the nuclear provision in the education fund. And the drafts that I've seen don't have either of those provisions in them right now.
Yeah, so Jim would have to load that into a bill.
Yeah.
Is that something, Mark, that you or Brianna would call him in regards to?
Oops. Sorry about that. Hope my house is not on fire, but I've already communicated this to Jim. So I think, and I haven't talked to him, but I sent him an email this morning.
Yeah. Any other questions before Mark jumps off? Well, we're
Mark,
gonna,
don't put the fire
as,
out.
as a farmer, we're gonna have this ground all wore out if we keep plowing.
Okay.
Um,
Talk to you later.
thank you, Mark, and I think Senator Kitchell will be getting a hold of you with some questions and concerns for the Appropriations Committee.
Yes, I just got an email from her. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so any
Hey, I see
further
Faye's hand.
say? You know, I
Thanks.
don't see that little yellow hand up there. If you just
All
go
right, well,
like
that's good
this
to know.
or holler
Um,
at me.
I will. I just wanted to throw out there and kind of go back to Senator Collmore. You were raising sort of this concern of if there's federal dollars used in some configuration that then they go away and we face that. And one thing to just consider in that idea is that it allows for some time for you all to see where within the 24 to $40 million range that JFO has projected where things are landing. If we're landing in that 24 to $29 million range that uses the participation rates that we know and that we see in schools now. It also allows for the legislature to see what's happening at the federal level over the next year or two around how school meals are paid for. There's a lot that could shift in the next few years, and by using federal dollars in some way may allow this to move forward and have Vermont on this path in a way that also allows for touch points to get reports on how it's going and how it's being implemented and what kinds of changes are happening that might change the cost, the share of the cost that Vermont is paying in whatever way we're paying. There's a lot that could happen, and there's a lot that couldn't happen. You know, I don't feel so confident that we're going to have federal universal school meals in the next 2 years to not move forward with this, but I think there are shifts and tweaks that are likely to happen that will shift the cost, this whole conversation around cost, and moving forward using some federal dollars to offset the impact could allow things to move forward in a way that works well for everyone, and gives some time to see how things are shifting. So I just wanted to add that to that conversation, as opposed to thinking about a whole, a need to have a whole sunset or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Bobby, I have a concern. So either way, we know it as the Ed Fund, but my concern is the schools that are already providing these meals, if they shift that off to the state, that'll increase that 24 to $40 million number, I'd assume. And they're not going to put that money, take that money out of their budgets. They're just going to spend it on something else. And they're going to see that we opened up that money for them. So I think the analysis becomes a lot tougher if we don't bake it into their budgets, to be 100% honest with you, because I think the schools that are doing it are going to just send that money over to us, and then they're still going to keep spending it. So I think it'll have an even bigger impact on property taxes.
Well, I think Rosie said they have to keep their school money separate. I don't know how separate, but have you got any comments on that, Rosie?
Sure. Well, first, Senator Parent, I can say that the initial estimate that the agency came up with 50 million as the high end, that kind of assumed the state taking on all those costs. So
Okay.
that might give you some idea of what that looks like. And again, that's at full participation with nobody submitting their free and reduced meal application. So that was our high end worst case kind of scenario. In terms of, they have to keep it in their child nutrition account. It basically depends on where, if they're subsidizing their universal meals program right now with general fund, then you're right. It could free up that general fund to do something else. They might very well decide to go ahead and do that. If they are one of the schools that is doing universal meals because the feds are paying for most of it, then it's really not going to have that much of an impact, because those funds are coming directly from the feds into their child nutrition program. They're not leaving the account at all. So there wouldn't be that impact. So it really
Do
depends.
we have an analysis of what that just might look like?
I can chime in with that too a bit. So we looked at the numbers based on that current participation rate, and kind of what we're seeing now. So within the joint fiscal office is $24 to $29 million range using those numbers. And for the schools that already have universal school meals, that kind of increased cost that they're paying for is about 2.9 million. And so it would, and as Rosie said, some of it would shift, that would be what could shift over if they're not fully covering it within their school budget. If some of their general fund is doing that, we don't know how much of that is being covered in the general fund versus they're making it work within their school meal program part of the budget.
Okay, so it's not a ton, but
It's not a
$2.9
huge amount, yeah. Because those are for many of those schools, those are the lower income schools, so they're getting a higher share of the federal paying reimbursement.
So if they're already getting subsidized, why would they switch over to switching anyway?
Well, they got a $2.9 million savings overall. They're gonna get every dollar they can, Bobby. You know that.
Well,
I mean, 2.9 doesn't scare me as much as 10 or 11, because then that's a penny all on its own. That they would just free up on quote unquote their budgets, but it would still just be the property taxpayer. Because I mean, I don't buy the argument that if you put it in our general fund, it doesn't raise tax. Wherever you put this, it raises taxes somewhere or cut spending somewhere. Whether it's a school budget or the state government's budget. I understand it creates budget pressures by doing something like this, but it's not like going to the state general fund all of a sudden keeps taxes lower for Vermonters. It changes another equation.
Well, plus, we've got that were you here when we talked about the different tax increases?
Yeah.
Depending on what policy we adopt.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean.
Plus our grand lists are all going to be growing. I mean, I got to imagine the state's looking at a huge, almost statewide reappraisal of if we have another year or two like we just had. Things are going to look a lot different.
That. I think everything's going to pot, houses aren't selling, businesses are closing. Never had it so bad. And there's surpluses here and surpluses there. I mean, they're crying wolf and there isn't anything to cry about, really.
I know, and the president just released a plan to spend $100 billion on building new school buildings. So they're going to have access to some of that if that passes Congress.
Yeah. Well, they're talking on the news about $3 trillion more coming to do infrastructure. I mean,
yeah, that's what the school buildings are part of.
We ought to be teaching these children how to raise a lot of money, because they're the ones that are going to be paying that bill when it comes due.
All those construction jobs puts money in people's pockets, puts money into the sales tax. I mean, this is what's so criminal about us not advancing this at the moment.
Yeah,
I mean, we're just in this, we're in this totally wild time. And is anyone going to say that in 5 years, when things settle down, we're going to regret having contributed $25 million to feeding every kid in Vermont schools? What a wasted opportunity. So, but I don't know what to do. I really don't know what to do. Maybe we should just ask to get a vote count and move it. I don't think, I'm not seeing a solution come forward that's going to relieve the tension. I just don't see it.
Chris, I just want to jump in. It's not all the kids, it's all public school kids.
No, the private schools, Linden Institute and
Right. The
I
academies
know
are in there.
the one in Newport does meals. Pardon?
So the bill doesn't require these schools to move. They have the option to do so, but I believe Brianna has said that that wouldn't change, bringing them in wouldn't change the fiscal note all that much. They're just not in right now because our understanding is that it's really hard to mandate something for an independent school. But they
Yeah,
have the
well, and
option, they have the option to do it.
Rosie?
This is an area where I've had a little bit of confusion because the bill right now doesn't discuss how to address the independent schools. So they can participate in the federal program, but as the bill is written right now, I would, one, not assume that they were required to provide meals, as Faye said, but also I'm not sure if we, if you're talking about if we move this to a state-funded thing, how are you anticipating, would we include them or not? Could, right now with the reduced price amount that the state pays to cover reduced price students, we do pay that for independent schools. But I would need some clarity in the bill about whether or not you would want us to do that for independent schools if you were going to pay that from the top of the ed fund or the general fund.
Well,
I can, oh, sorry, Senator.
go ahead.
Jim and I talked about that when he was drafting the amendment, and our intent when we had been suggesting ideas was that it would, the independent the non-public schools would have access to that if they met the requirements. He couldn't figure out quickly how to write that. And so he didn't include it at the time. That might be something to address in the House if the bill is able to move forward of how to bring those schools in.
I thought I read in the report that we got from somebody that Christian Academy in Newport, which is an independent school, they were listed in there for hot lunches and stuff.
Yes. Oh, sorry, Rosie, do you want to go?
There are independent schools who participate in the National School Lunch Program and provide free and reduced price meals to students through that program. But the question here is, do you want to include them in universal meals versus just the regular school meals program?
We'll let them go hungry, right? No, they all should be in,
So if you want to do that, you need to write that into the bill so that we have instruction to do that.
The other issue we haven't decided is the locally produced foods, right? That was taken out by, I think, appropriations, and as far as I know, it's not in there again.
No, it's not in there, and I was hoping that the House would, add that back in, or if it came back with a committee of conference, that we would put it back in at that point in time. But I think the issue is if we can, is to try to reach a compromise and move this forward to the House, and then work out the let them do their lifting as well.
What do you think that should be, Mr. Chair?
You mean the compromise that we put together? Well, I was hoping one of you would suggest that. I mean, I know I get paid the big bucks to chair the meeting. But no, I
mean, I agree with Senator Pearson. I don't think there's going to be any eloquent solution to come in the next few days out of us that is going to alleviate everyone's concerns. I think these things have a long process. So the whole point of the process is if you don't get your way in this turn, you have a few other stops to go and more eyes to look at it and come at it from different angles. So I don't know how much more work we can do on it at this point, to be honest with you.
Well, I mean, it's all we got to do is put our pieces together and come up, have Jim write that into the bill and get it down to Campion. so he can look at it, hopefully tomorrow. He said he'd have an hour of time. I think he said tomorrow, and because, yeah, we need to move this to the, if we can, move it to the other body. And if Brian and the Ed Committee could look at it, tomorrow, and we may be able to move it a week from, not Tuesday, because it'd be on notice, but Wednesday.
Well, it's up for action, but if that's the case, then if we can accept that there will be some loose ends, then what I would suggest is we take yesterday's draft, which more or less directed it to be off the top of the ed fund. We leave it vague about the 5-year phase in. We
No
leave
phase in, Chris?
No, we just say the bill has always just said by the end of the next 5 years. So I hear Rosie's point. I'm open to doing the 20% a year, but I hear Rosie say, how in the world am I going to do that? So to me, I would just leave that as one of the things we haven't perfected, and just basically take yesterday's draft, which takes it off the top of the ed fund, make sure Peralt's amendments are in there that make it workable and allowable expense and appropriation, and see if do a vote count on that. I mean, I just don't know if there was a solution, as Senator Parent said, that relaxed everybody, I'd be glad to live with a compromise, but we're not finding it. We're not going to find it if we talk about this for another hour or another 10 hours. So we got to just make some tough decisions. And I am eager to have the House work on it, because we don't have to stop working on it ourselves. But
No.
if we don't send it over to them, we're basically saying the best we could do is next year. This gives us some shot at this year.
What about that date? I thought we wanted to put in there that this would start as the federal programs or certain part of the program stop, but we don't have that in there now, I
No.
don't believe. So
That's true. So we could
need to
stipulate
add that in.
Stipulate that this is on hold until the USDA waiver goes away, something like that.
Would that work, Rosie?
So I don't actually think that you need to do that, because the way that it's structured in the version, the amendment version from yesterday, is that you're paying the difference between the free and the paid rate, which if the waivers continue as they are, there is no difference, so you wouldn't need to pay anything. So I think you actually can get away with not putting that in there. And it also is kind of nice in that way, where if the feds decided, okay, we're actually going to pay like an additional, 20 more cents for paid meals or something, that your state costs would just be reduced. So it does give you some flexibility with regard to what the feds do, where you probably don't have to come back and make a lot of changes.
And then what about, we've got to add language to allow all schools to participate or something to that effect, so that, the private schools that are participating already can continue. Is that a particular line of certain language, do you know, Rosie, or
I would be looking for a line that would direct the agency to pay out that difference in free versus paid reimbursement rate to any independent schools participating in the National School Lunch Program, as well as public schools. It might not actually be in there for the reduced price payment. That's how we've always done it. So that might be why we were having some difficulty with language on that. But I would not feel particularly comfortable without it in there, knowing
No,
what the authority was or was not. So it's such a nominal amount for the reduced price that I don't think it's ever really been discussed, but we're talking about a lot more money here.
What else have we forgot to ask Jim to put in?
Well, just,
Anything?
we have to be clear that, and I think we should leave this open. I mean, again, we're not going to be able to answer all the questions, but we are leaving in this draft, we're not addressing the schools that currently offer. And our attempt to solve that has been significantly confusing. So I think we leave some work for our friends in the House to do.
I would expect that under this draft, those who are currently offering it would just, rather than them having to eat the cost of the paid meals, we'd pay them for the paid meals. So I don't think there's anything more that you would need to do there unless you wanted to handle it differently.
So, Brian, you had your hand up?
I did. I guess I wanted to know about whether you folks on the other side of the aisle had any show of support when you last met. I will tell you that the administration and my caucus has weighed in while we were talking about this morning. And I still think we have some concerns, but how did it go with your guys?
I would say generally okay, but they were questioning, you know, I think they wanted to take it off, like if we got 1.7 billion in the ed fund, they wanted to take the money off the top of that, so there'd only be 1,600,000,000 and so many thousands of dollars. They want to take it off the top, and instead of building it into everybody's budget, because it would be they felt more fair if it came right off the top, and schools would not see, definitely would not see any tax increase that way. And the sales tax is the big driver on the ed fund, and we haven't got projections beyond next year yet, but the projections are that that's on its way up, not down. And so they're, as we ramp up the program, that ramps up as well. So that was I think the thinking. I don't know, did you get a different opinion, Chris or Anthony?
No.
No,
I mean,
well, people were certainly more open to taking it off the top than they were with the original proposal, which was making the schools come up with the money. I'm still not sure I'm not sure where a vote count would come down, to be perfectly honest. I'm not sure. And I think that if we're going to if we want to move it to the other chamber, we have to at least be willing to consider what kind of compromise, where our bottom line would be. I'm not sure where that is yet at this point. Some kind of phase in or breakfast first, that kind of thing. I think we should, at least amongst ourselves, have a sense as to where we want to draw the line.
Well, I think at this point, if we're going to try to move the whole thing, our B plan would be to drop back to just a breakfast plan, because the dinosaur thing, we can't make it work. And
right, I think the dinosaur thing, we're not going to, even if we could make it work, we couldn't make it work between now and whenever the vote comes up. I think there'd be too many questions, and
yeah,
I think that the breakfast thing at least is very clear, people understand it. I think they would be willing to accept it. It may not be exactly where we wanted to go, but I think that for the average member, it's going to be like, okay, I get this. I understand it. It's something that we've been doing at some level for years. And it seems like a logical expansion of the breakfast program as opposed to taking on something that's really monumental. I wish we didn't have to do that, to tell you the truth, but I think that it's something that people could wrap their heads around in a much more easy way than they could the other stuff we're talking about.
Well,
And-
but hold on. We are making a change right now from the original draft, which is not pushing it to the local schools.
Right.
What we don't know is if that calms the superintendent's down, but I got to believe it does. And once you do that,
I don't disagree with that. I was just saying, if that doesn't work, we have to know where our bottom line is. I think taking it off the top of the ed fund, based on what we've been hearing, could pass. I just think if it's not going to, if we find out later today or tomorrow that it's not going to, then where we're going to draw the line.
I still struggle with that one because I think voters should actually have a vote on. I struggle on anything that is paid for education that isn't available for the voters to vote on in March. I think that's why we have these runaway costs, is because they don't know the real cost of their system. And I don't really want to continue to perpetuate that.
The way you're going to do, change the whole
Yeah.
system?
I'd put it in their budgets. They can find the money elsewhere. We all
No,
have
they
to.
They don't have a clue what they're voting for now. So what about like my little town, $3.6 million? They only pay that much of it. So I don't, you'd have to change the whole system, Corey, to get to your point.
Yeah, but I agree with you. And that's not a task, but we're perpetuating the bad in the current system by not, in my mind, having it there. So I don't know. I struggle with it.
well, we're all
The-
struggling with some piece of this.
Yeah, we're not.
I know, but I like the original one.
Well, so do I, but we don't have the votes for that. We have to assume that.
I just don't see how
I
this
think-
alleviates any concern, because it's still, if it comes off the ed fund, it's still going to come off the property tax in some level, even if we
No.
use it because the sales tax increases to offset. Those are monies that can't be used to keep property taxes lower. So at some point, it still hits the property tax.
Yeah,
Have
but they
they-
don't have to pass it in their budget. That's why the superintendents prefer this.
Only 2 budgets went down this year. Like, budgets don't go down.
I
in
mean,
Vermont.
I agree. That's why I liked the original bill too, but
Yeah, I mean, we did the right thing from the get-go, but we've got to convince 25 others, but we did have 6 people in ed and 7 people in the probes that supported what we did until the superintendents cried foul. So,
We have too many of those. Can we stick that in the bill? Consolidate superintendents to pay for school meals?
yeah, that's what we ought to do.
you can
But,
hint it to the number of senators.
The
Fair enough. We only need 2 in Franklin County, in my mind.
need 2 senators.
No, 2 I think we have too many superintendents. I mean, that's where the real cost driver is.
All right, so
Well,
what are we
I-
doing, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, so we've got an A plan and a B plan. So we'll have Jim put that language together. I don't know how busy he is this morning. Gail, can you find Jim and see if he's gonna have any free time this morning?
I'm sorry, Chairman Starr, who are you looking for?
Jim Desiree,
Okay,
and see if he's gonna have any free time this morning to draft up an amendment for the committee. And I don't know, I wish we could push this a little harder where if on the 20 percentile a year for the 5 years and try to keep that cost down under, you know, at 0.6 or 0.7 of a cent per year increase, because people hear that 50 million and they run with that. I mean, we should never have talked about 50 million. Brian?
Yep, thanks, Bobby. So once we get the draft, if it's now Thursday, so Corey and I can share that with my caucus tomorrow morning and get a sense of where they are. And it'll go over to Campion's crew and they can look at it. And
yeah, hopefully Jim would be able to do that this morning, and we could look at it, as a group. Chris?
I just want to make sure I've been taking notes, and I want to make sure this is what we're asking for, because I can work with Jim if people want. We've got where we started yesterday, which was the off the top of the ed fund discussion. We're gonna direct the agency to include independent schools.
Yeah.
We're gonna add Peralt's language about an appropriation and an acceptable line item or something.
Yeah, to make sure. Yeah.
And that's it, right? That it's already handles the mystery of whether or not the USDA will extend for a year or do something. And then we have the 5-year question. Do you want to try and mess with that at this point or not?
I think it should be in there somehow.
Well, right now, it's permissive, but the concern is if it's not on the local budget, they'll swarm in and I'll do it. And I'm open to that. I actually think there's wisdom in that, because I really am frustrated by the notion that we're going to come out of a year of universal meals, go back to the old way, then come back in. That doesn't make a ton of sense to me. But one idea, I hate to add a new idea, but one idea would be to say, it'll come off the top of the ed fund. Maybe this gets the senator parent. It'll come off the top of the ed fund for 5 years, and then we'll ratchet it down onto the locals. Then 80% will come off the ed fund, and then you could phase it in like that. But anyway, the bigger question is, if we're paying for it off the top of the ed fund, do we want everybody in on year one, or do we want to say there's some special formula that Rosie's going to dream up to figure out what 20% comes in each year?
Well, I think somehow we should control that, because if we tell folks that we're giving it a 5-year phase in and we're trying to keep it so it doesn't overrun the money, we got to give our economy an opportunity to grow, and the income that comes into the ed fund to grow, because this is going to grow. Next year, it's going to be another 0.7% higher, in the year after, beyond so it'd be 14% or whatever, 1.4%. So, we should phase it in, because it's sort of a big ticket item. And if you let that grow with our economy, then, you don't put any pain, hopefully, on really anybody that's unbearable.
I just don't see how you phase it in. It's really hard to do. I think having everybody say they will clamor to get on it right away is a good sign. It shows the importance of it in the sport for it. Might be better to let everybody in on the first year if they want to come in on the first year. Otherwise, I don't know how you distinguish who's going to get in, who's not going to get in the first year.
Well, Rosie, do you have something you want to add?
So if you were going to do a phase in, I would suggest phasing in with breakfast first and then moving to lunch later, rather than doing 20% of everything. So your idea of 20% would be 20% of the schools would get breakfast and lunch paid for each year. And a much easier phase in to implement would be everybody gets breakfast the first year. And then a few years later, if you feel like you can handle it at that point, everybody gets lunch. And that would still be a way of dividing up the cost, not quite the way you're thinking 20% over 5 years, but it would disperse it over the 5 years. And that would be administratively feasible compared to the bad feelings that I think we'd get with, you know, kind of 20%.
You know, I hate to say it this way, but on the one hand, if we phased it in, if we said breakfast first, and we could push it off to some task force of people that come up with a long-term funding mechanism for the lunch part.
Well, it'll certainly answer
Yeah.
some of the financial.
Oh, Jim's
Go ahead.
back. I
Yep.
got phone ringing and the cat crying and so, hey, Jim, we have, I don't know if you got some time to work on an amendment.
You're muted.
I think I read your
Yes.
lips and you said most definitely.
I said I'll make time.
Well, I don't know, Chris, did you want to work with Jim on doing that?
Sure, happy to. The main thing is Peralt's got some language that he needs you to put in there. So you should connect with him. It's about an allowable expense and an appropriation. That's the main thing. And this would be building off of yesterday's amendment, not the latest, but then we're still torturing ourselves with different ideas.
So,
Yeah.
so you're working off of, so you're not doing universal breakfast, you're doing.
Not right. Well, no matter what we do, we need Peralt has some language that we need in there. So start by reaching out to him and ask him what he needs.
Okay.
And that,
Drafting off of yesterday's amendment, which is your,
Off the top. Yeah.
okay, all right.
and
And then, sorry, but Jim, I'll be glad to bring you in the rest of the details once we settle on them, if we do.
Okay, I'll talk to Mark.
Thanks.
so we need, Chris, we need to talk with, I think, Becca too, to see, get some direction there on our side and we've got, I think, pretty good arguments to present to the caucus or to at least Becca. And, it's amazing that, I thought we had pretty good support last night from, all the nasty or not nasty notes, but notes of concern that we all received. That seemed good. What not?
Just while we've been sitting here, I got a note from superintendent. I responded. I said, "Does it make a difference if we take it off the top?" And she said, "Absolutely." So maybe that is the secret to getting them on board.
Yeah. So Brian.
Yep, thank you, Bobby. So I'm kind of like, well, out of all the possible solutions here, I think Rosie's last one makes, to me, the most sense, and I think Senator Polina agreed too. If we start with breakfast, and I'm doing the math here, that was going to be between 6 and 10 million, and add give or take a cent to the property tax. And then you subtract the cost of the breakfast from the total of what was 24 to 40. Lunch would then cost between 18 and 30. And we would be able to, I think Senator Polina said, put something in the bill that which would charge a group of folks to come up with a way to pay for that. I think, I'm just of the opinion that I think if we truly wanted to get a ramp with this, that the breakfast first makes more sense. Because I think it's less abrupt. You know, it's less like a cliff and more like a ramp. Those are just.
Well, Brian, the breakfast, unless we phase it in, is a penny, I believe.
Yeah, yeah.
The other deal is 6 or 7 tenths of a cent a year. Over, yeah,
5 years.
over the 5 years, because we're gonna phase it in. So the breakfast, if we fully implement that, like we talked about, that's gonna cost the overall pot of money more money the first year than if we phase in the full universal meals program over 5 years. The way I figured it, I don't know if anybody else fooled with the numbers.
That seems
Well,
to defy logic, though.
Pardon?
It seems to defy logic. I don't know. I guess you're right.
Oh,
Mr. Chair, that the difference is that you continue to assume a 20% jump every year. But once we say it's off the top of the ed fund, don't worry about it locally, we'll have to construct some parameters for how you keep that
at
going
20.
at a 2020. Otherwise, you're going to have 100.
Real quick, maybe.
Yeah, because it's a good idea.
Well, it's the right thing to do. I don't know if it's a good idea, but it's the right thing to do. That's for sure. Well, maybe we ought to spend some time thinking about suggestions and ways that we can phase this in some type of a fashion so that it doesn't cause Rosie to quit her job. But there's got to be some way that we can do this. I've never seen an issue yet that we couldn't figure out if we thought about it and thought about all the different angles of dealing with it. Are we, our guests being there with us, are we forgetting, did we forget to ask Jim ask him, did we tell him all the different things we needed? Did we forget anything?
Well, I think Chris was going to keep the list, and when he meets with them, he was going to include them.
Yeah.
Adding the independent schools, whatever else we talked about.
Right.
Yeah. And Brian, did you get that figured out so that the numbers, so that where if we go with just breakfast, it's going to cost more the first year than if we went with the full meals program? You have that number, right?
Yeah, no, I have that. The breakfast is between 6 and 10 million, depending on how many do it, and it'll add approximately a penny, to the property tax, because for every 8 million, you add a penny.
Yeah.
So it's right in the middle of 6 and 10 is 8. The combination of breakfast and lunch would have added 3 to 5 cents, because you're talking between 24 and 40. So once you've done it, it's not 7/10 of a, I mean, it might be that every year, but the 5th year, that's what it costs. So
Yeah,
but the first year, that's what the breakfast cost.
right. Yeah,
So that's
and
all I
it
would
would
say.
stay, it would stay constant unless the legislature decided to move in year 3, say, to the full meals program.
Yeah,
And
a future legislature could do anything they want, yeah.
yeah, and so, you know, the other thing is the start date. And Rosie, you haven't pushed us very hard on that, but I really question whether that could start next year anyways. I mean, we won't be out of session until May or June, or God only knows when. And to think that this could, even if it passed the House and all this, I don't see any way we got to change those start dates, I think.
So I think that if you give me the position that's included in the bill, I am confident that I could implement breakfast only, that option. I could implement that next year. I'm anxious about the implementation of, well, I do not think I could implement the other idea of the Medicaid threshold and having that whole second category. That certainly is not implementable next year.
No.
But assuming the additional staff person at the Agency of Education and assuming a July 1st implementation, I do feel like I could do breakfast. I am concerned about if you wanted to do a 20% situation, because we need to set up that process for folks deciding to do it, and that would be a little bit more difficult to figure out in a very short period of time. We don't have to, the staff work that's associated with going to Provision 2 doesn't have to happen before the start of the school year. It's better if it happens early in the school year, but it's not something that needs to happen immediately before the students are actually in session. So that's what would make that more implementable. It's still going to be a lift. No question of that.
Yeah.
But if you're able to give the additional position, I think it's doable.
Well, certainly if what you told us the other day comes true, if the feds let us know next month, I think you thought that they might let us know in April if they were gonna extend the waiver. We would know for sure. We'll still be in town. And if you needed something changed in the bill, we'll probably still be working on it. Not us, but hopefully the House. And so I think we have some time there to figure that out. That would help us all. So are there other questions from anybody? Brianna, thanks a lot for all your work on this. It was good that you got Mark to lean on you, and well, Brianna can answer that. Brianna can answer this. That's good. It's good for you, and he knew that you could handle it, and that's great. So if there isn't anything else, Chris, did Jim have any idea when he might get something put together?
I'm not sure.
Well, folks, we could have Gail send you a note if we get that back from Jim, and if you want to come and look that draft over.
So what am I, we got Jim going with the Peralt language.
Yeah.
What else am I asking him to change from yesterday?
Look at your notes.
Yeah, my
And-
notes say about independent schools,
Yeah,
and that was it.
that's it.
Yeah, I'm not trying to be cheeky. I had to step out for half a second and I may have missed it, but
No, no, we didn't add anything that I know. We talked about the implementation date, maybe a little bit while you were out, but Rosie thought that, that the Dr. Dinosaur thing is a year out, if that happened. Breakfast, no problem, and the full meals doesn't have to be really done real soon, so that she felt comfortable with that.
so but we're not directing her on that. We're leaving that kind of open.
Well, we've got an implementation date of what, next September, this coming
Well,
September.
Okay,
But
all right. I'm fine with that.
I
Thank you.
don't think there's anything else. Jim, you already had the money on the ed fund off the top. I was thinking we could take, a 10 or 15-minute break, and maybe Jim would have that together by then and we could come back.
Okay,
Any-
sounds good.
Want to do 15 minutes? Good.
How about we
Okay,
make it,
so-
do
Pardon?
you want to say 11:15, just so maybe
Yeah,
it
that's
seems like
okay.
we're at
11:15, we'll come back. Brianna,
I was just
I'll
wondering
do-
if you would like support from me when you come back, or if you are willing to take it from here.
as long as want to make sure that you look at Jim's numbers and they fall in line with what you've given us.
Okay, I can be available. That's no problem.
Okay. And so we'll see you all at 11:15. Rosie, if you want have time, you and can punch in, you could be back and look that final draft. I hope final draft over. So Gail, did you have something for us?
No, I just wanted to confirm that I'm taking the committee offline.
Oh, yeah, and we'll